Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, October 20th. And, well, did you have a good weekend?
I did. I did have a good weekend.
Okay, good.
And I hope you had the same.
Yeah, it was all right. Um, okay, so what's the big news going on? I hear there's a lot of chatter about Ukraine now recently with, this flurry of pseudo diplomatic relations, Trump calling Putin and
Right.
the tomahawks and everything. But just listening to dissident media in general, I'm getting the sense that a lot of people think we're in the end game now. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, again, I'm reluctant to say that because I've heard that many times before. I, I think, as I maybe once mentioned one time previous to this, I remember way back in 2022, it was just, somebody in the dissident media saying it looks like the Ukrainian lines are about to buckle. And clearly they weren't about to buckle. But there's no question there has been an acceleration in, let's say, Russian advances quantitatively and qualitatively over the last few years. And then if you look at what the Ukrainians are doing or haven't been doing over the last few years, it's clear that they are weakening. And just to give an example, think about what happened in 2022. The Ukrainians did have some major successes. They actually, launched some offensives that really went somewhere, most notably in the Kharkov region. Now, it was true, it was very lightly defended, but they did pull it off and they took a big chunk of territory there. And then Kherson, they did advance. The Russians at first fought them and inflicted very heavy casualties, in Kherson in the south. The Ukrainians still managed to advance, not very much, but they were taking some territory. And then the Russians made the decision that their position was too precarious there on the right bank of the Dnieper, and they needed to cross, to retreat to the left bank. And they did it, and they did it very successfully in good order, suffering no losses. But you have to say those were major successes. A lot of it was, again, it's just the relative strengths at that time. The Russians had many fewer soldiers than the Ukrainians did. And then the next year, okay, well, that was the year 2023, is the Great Summer Offensive, and it did take some territory, but much less than was taken in 2022. And then in 2024. And again, the losses were huge. Okay, in 2024, they did have one offensive, and that was a surprise attack, the invasion of Kursk, the Kursk region. And they did take a chunk of territory. Now, that proved to be catastrophic, and it didn't last long. The Russians are taking back everything that was taken. I think they've already taken back a while ago. They took everything back that was taken by the 2023 offensive. They are gradually, steadily taking back what was taken in the 2022 offensive in Kharkov. Now, there was that one incursion, into Kursk in 2024. That was catastrophic. It didn't last very long. That was it. Now we're in 2025. The Ukrainians have done nothing. So I think you can just looking at that, and there's a lot of other measures that we can take. This is just one example. You see there is a steady tilting towards the Russian side. The Russians are growing stronger, the Ukrainians weaker. The relative strengths have really changed, and that will continue. Now, are we in the end game? It's just there's still a lot of territory. That's what I would say to take. If indeed the Russians are going to take, as they have promised, back all of Donbass, and then, but more importantly, all of Zaporozhye and all of Kherson. Now, Donbass still, I think we're on the verge of seeing these a number of major settlements. We're talking about small cities or towns or fairly large towns in most cases, and strategically important ones. Kupiansk, Seversk, Kramatorsk. Actually, Liman is another one that is not quite, is the Russians haven't reached it, but they're approaching it, at a good rate. They'll soon be there. Liman, that's up in the north too, the Kharkov region. And then, most importantly, there's Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk, and then farther south, there's not a major city there, but all of these are going to fall. And I think they will, probably most of them will fall by the end of this year. And then whatever remains is going to fall, within a couple months, early next year. It could even be faster than that. But still, just think about what remains. There's still Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. These are major cities in the Donbass. I expect they will fall next year, and then all the Donbass will be taken, I probably within the first half of the year. But in Zaporozhye, okay, they are making, the Russians are making good, steady progress. That's where they're moving the fastest, is in to Zaporozhye and to Dnipropetrovsk. But there is the city of Zaporozhye, and we're talking about a big city. Now, maybe, again, the Ukrainians at that point will be so weak that it'll go quickly. But that's a major city. And then when you're talking about Kherson, they have to cross the river. And that's a very, difficult operation that, they're going to. So there's still a lot ahead of us. I guess I'm reluctant to say that we're in the end game. And if indeed they're going to go on to Odessa and Kharkov City is the second largest city in Ukraine. We're talking about many hundreds of thousands of people there. And then Odessa is they have to cross first the Dnieper, go through Kherson, and then there are other rivers, other barriers. It's going to be difficult. Again, I think we're going to see that this trend will continue, and at some point it may accelerate rapidly. And a rapid acceleration of the trend is what we call a collapse. And that could happen, at any time. It's not just that the Russians are treating them on the front lines, as clearly they are, but their air war is picked up, and they're doing, a lot of damage to Ukraine's war effort that way. Again, on the attacks on the energy infrastructure, on the rail system, on their, military industry. This is all putting a serious dent into Ukraine's war effort. So they are being pressed hard, both from the air and the ground. And it could happen soon. It's just that, again, I've heard, we've had this sense, we could see this trend. It's been going on for a while. It's hard to say when it will really accelerate rapidly. In other words, when we will really have a collapse. And so I'm just reluctant to make especially when I see all the things that the Russians need to do. I'm reluctant to say that we're in the end game yet.
Yeah, when we talk about a collapse, we're often thinking about the front line, and if there's just a total rout on the front line and then it breaks down. But do you think that it's more likely that the collapse could be within the Kyiv regime itself, within the government, that there's enough civil unrest that causes the collapse? Because like you said, the Russians are hitting the energy infrastructure pretty hard, the railroad system. This is beginning to affect the daily lives of every Ukrainian now. They're just power outages, and we're in fall now. Winter is coming around the corner. How is the winter going to affect people if they're not able to keep the lights on and keep the heating running? This could be, catastrophic for Ukraine. Do you see that as a possibility?
Well, it's a possibility. And there certainly is a trend again in that direction that we can see in the polls. Whereas at the beginning, it was a very large majority, like 80%, said no negotiations. We're just going to defeat the Russians, right? That's how most Ukrainians thought, the ones that were polled. And now that is pretty much reversed. It's flip-flopped. There's a great majority, like 75% in the most recent poll, I think, that I've seen was a couple months ago, who say, please negotiate. And there's only maybe 25% who are still, we're going to win this, no negotiations. So there is a trend, and you can see so there is a growing gap between the stated policy of the government, Zelensky's regime, I think, is fair to call it, and the people, because Zelensky is still he's very much on the no negotiation, no real negotiations. Talk about a ceasefire, but clearly that would just give him a chance to restock and to actually, continue the fight later on. I think he understands that they're in bad shape, but he still said the stated goal is to take back the territories and not to negotiate in any meaningful way. the only sort of he's gone along with the ceasefire idea, but that's not real negotiations. So anyway, I think there is this gap, but we're still a long ways, I think, from a collapse in that sense. In other words, some sort of coup or uprising. It seems like Zelensky is really consolidating his power. He has a firm grip on power, and he's making it firmer. Most recently he removed the mayor of Odessa. I guess the problem is that he wasn't sufficiently, in tune with Zelensky. He wasn't sufficiently subservient to him. So anyway, he was removed, and somebody more loyal to Zelensky was put in place. And that's just an example of a further consolidation of power. That's the sort of thing that he's been doing without really any significant opposition. The only popular opposition that we saw was the protest against his efforts to remove or kind of defang the anti-corruption agencies, if you remember. And people went out on the streets. But I think that's because these were basically like creatures of the European Union, and so all the people that are on I'm exaggerating, but a lot of these people on the streets are on a EU payroll, basically, NGO payroll, and they did protest, and he was forced to back down, but I think in the end he did manage to, let's say, defang those agencies, but just not so openly.
You say that Zelensky is not willing to give up any territory, no territory. But Trump just made some comment, I think it was this morning or yesterday, saying that, yeah, you're going to have to give up some territory. And I guess Zelensky is just saying, yeah, that's out of the question. Why is Zelensky unwilling to budge on this when it's clear? I mean, start at least with Crimea. I mean, we know that's been Russia's Black Sea port since Catherine the Great built it up, This is that's non-negotiable. I feel like the idea that they would take Crimea is ridiculous. But I mean, even also the Donbass, why would Zelensky want to control a land that has been a thorn in their side for so long, that has been in a civil war with them since 2014? These people do not want the Zelensky's regime there. They will, even if Russia pulls out, you're going to have to still deal with insurgency problems in the Donbass for as long as Ukraine and this government of Ukraine exists. So why is he so unwilling to give up the territory of people that you shouldn't want to rule anyways, because they don't want to be part of you? It's just going to be a headache for you. Why not? Why can he not just say like?
Yeah, well, you see, I mean, that's kind of part of the larger question. Why didn't it seems like the most humane solution to the conflict would have been what happened in, the former Czechoslovakia, an amicable divorce. And, again, we have two nations at peace with each other, the Czech Republic on the one hand and Slovakia on the other. And that could have happened, because there's just clear, you could see there's a real dividing line that's based on history, and it would show up in every election. You look at the map, and it was always the same. There were these regions in the east and the south that always voted for the party that was not necessarily pro-Russian. That's really an exaggeration, but wanted to maintain good relations with Russia and with the EU. Actually, they wanted to do both. And then on the other side, in central and western Ukraine, you had, that was the opposition, the people that actually wanted to cut off relations with Russia and tilt sharply to the EU. That's the difference. But this is what you found all along. It's just actually there has never been, I have never heard anyone in Russia or within, let's say, the Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine who have said, we want to impose Russian on the whole country. We want to ban the Ukrainian language. And in fact, in like the territories, including Crimea, where that are now ruled by Russia, there is a right to have your child taught in your own language. So Ukrainian language is offered. There are schools that are offered. It is part, and this is something that is part of Russia. Russia is a multi-confessional, multi-ethnic state. And I, like recently I just a couple months ago, I was in the autonomous Republic of Tatarstan, where Kazan is located, and you see on all the official signs that they're in two languages, in Russian and in Tatar. So they recognize it. This is part of Russian policy. So, but you have in the West, there is this drive for purity, that goes back to Bandera and his people. I mean, this is the truth. That there is only one. It's a mono-ethnic Ukraine. Is the Ukraine that they've envisioned, and rather than, again, I think the intelligent thing to do, if that's really important to you, and your Ukrainian identity separate from a Russian one is very, very important to you, well, the intelligent thing, the feasible thing, would have been to have that amicable divorce. But they have never considered that possibility. They've always insisted on imposing this vision on the whole country and forcing Russians in the East and the South. And the Russian speakers are actually found, through the whole country, but especially in those regions and through, much of the central part, including Kyiv too, imposing this, this Ukrainian language on all of them and a Ukrainian identity, just a denigration and of Russian heroes, the toppling of statues to great Russians of the past, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is something they want to impose on the whole country, and I think there's really no question about it. You can see what they've done both before, the launch of the SMO. You can't say it was just a reaction to it. It was obviously, it's something that's been building up, and it accelerated after 2014, and then it has continued to accelerate. This is the policy. It's a mono-ethnic policy that doesn't tolerate minorities, such as Russians and Hungarians, Romanians, etc. And then, so what does he want to do? Well, he wants to impose that. And I think even you have to say that they've made statements to this effect that they would be willing to ethnically cleanse the Donbass, and their behavior, towards the Donbass ever since the uprising back in 2014 has certainly demonstrated that there are elements, very powerful elements within Ukrainian society that do want to ethnically cleanse, just to say, so, how do you explain the constant attacks on civilians that has gone on ever since 2014 and has resulted in the deaths of many thousands of what they, according to them, are Ukrainians, right? The clear attacks on civilians. We're not talking about collateral damage, there was an attempt to strike some military target and the missile went off course or something. These things happen, but clearly intentional, and it happens. It's happening to this day. I actually see these reports every day. I don't think there's been an exception in the last several months. I can't think of any. It's just, I'll check in and you can see every day, especially in the bordering regions, places like Belgorod and Bryansk, but also in the Donetsk region, in Donetsk city still from time to time, there are civilians that are killed. They're not civilians that happen to be near some military target, but somebody driving down a road, that kind of thing. Somebody who was just out, she was out in her front yard and she got struck by a drone. And, we're talking about FPV drones. They know what they're doing. They're deliberately killing civilians. These are supposed to be fellow Ukrainians, but now they regard them as terrorists. That's or worse, in a way that's not so different from the way the Israelis regard the Palestinians. So I think, there certainly are powerful groups, factions within Ukraine that would just ethnically cleanse this, would want to do this, and they may have the power to do it. At the very least, they would just suppress them, and as we've seen within the areas that they control right now.
So if you think that if for whatever reason Russia just pulls out of Ukraine, we'll probably see a lot of Ukrainians that are in the Donbass or Russians, however you want to view them. They'll probably flee into Russia. The ones that remain, you think there's a good chance that they will be ethnically cleansed? That after
I think
this,
there's a chance. Again, I wouldn't say that it's the whole government is committed to this vision, but clearly there are people, and I think I mentioned in a previous episode that we did, that Yulia Tymoshenko, has been a very prominent politician in Ukrainian politics for many, many years, and has recently been considered, as considered a favorite of the West, a possible replacement for Zelensky. At least a year ago, there was some talk of that. I don't think that's possible, really, but there was. She clearly has her supporters within the West. But she made this comment that, maybe the solution is nuclear weapons. In other words, just, wipe them out. And so there is this genocidal impulse. I'm not saying that is the policy of the government as a whole, but there are these people, and it is demonstrated by this behavior that we see every day. Again, you think about it, Ukraine's military resources are very limited. Yet they use these drones, but even HIMARS missiles, striking marketplaces and so on, killing civilians. Deliberately killing civilians. I think there's just no question about it. So there is a risk of it. I don't know how big the risk would be of actual ethnic cleansing. I think it would happen at least in part, and it could be massive. Who knows?
Well, I think that will never happen, and let's pray it never happens. But Zelensky's really painting himself in a corner, right? What's the reason that he's not willing to budge at all? He has to at some point. Do you think that he's going to die on this hill, saying that we're going to get back all territory, which we know is impossible? Because what you're saying now at this point is that it means the total defeat of Russia, which is just insane. It's not going to happen. Right. So do you think he's going to eventually change his position on this and accept, okay, maybe we can at least get to the negotiating table and we can talk about where to draw the line? Or do you think that this is going to end with him in his bunker and then until they break down the door and put a bullet in his head? How far is this going to go?
Yeah, I don't think he's ever going to. He and his supporters, his regime is ever going to accept the loss of territory. I think they have committed themselves, to this vision, and they would rather, again, lose the war, lose the most of Ukraine, than acknowledge the Russian victory, to bend their knee to Russia and to actually, accept the loss of territories. We just don't see any sign of it. His position has not been softening; it's been hardening over the years.
So this will end then when the Zelensky and the Banderite, that's what we should call it, the Banderite regime, we should say, until there's some new form of government that has not adopted this.
Right.
Sort of
again, Zelensky wasn't a Banderite when he was elected, and he was elected on this peace platform, and he made some, rather feeble efforts, but some efforts to actually carry through on his promise to implement the Minsk agreement. But, clearly he learned pretty quickly, who was really in charge. And then it seems like he has now internalized this way of thinking. I don't think he would describe himself as a Banderite, unlike Zelensky or something. He doesn't have a bust of Bandera in his office, but he has the regime, which when it first took power, in the coup in 2014, it was still, a majority non-Banderite. The Banderites were a minority, but they had become a very important minority because of the essential role that they played. Essentially, they were the muscle. They were the ones who actually overthrew the government of Yanukovych, and so they were rewarded, with very important posts and within the government. And then immediately afterwards, they began to have the rebellion in the east. And then the Ukrainian government realized that they couldn't rely on their own forces. Many of them who were especially out in the east, were very sympathetic with the rebels. And so they turned again to the ultranationalists, to the Banderites. And that was a marriage made in hell. It was in essence, they sold their soul to the devil. And since then, that Banderite influence has grown and grown. And and so people like Zelensky, who originally were not really Banderites, have become, in their thinking, they have adopted this ultranationalism and this very fervid belief in a monoethnic, Ukraine. Yeah, I actually can't remember exactly what your question was at this point, but
I forget as well, but that's all right.
yeah. Well, one thing I wanted
But
to, well, we're talking about the loss of the territories and, and his unwillingness to accept it. I think when we're on this topic, we should mention that once again, there have been leaked, or reports, let's say that again, in a conversation, this is according to the Washington Post, that they said in a conversation or a telephone call between Trump and Putin. And it's interesting that they say rather than we're only aware of the one, but this implies that there may have been a previous one because he says one of the conversations they've had. And according to Larry Johnson, he's now in Moscow, from somebody who's in the know that there was at least one other one, where Trump actually called Putin, I think, on his birthday. So in one of these conversations on the telephone, Putin, once again, according to the Washington Post, offered to accept a ceasefire in the regions of Kherson and Zaporozhye, but he insisted but only if the Ukrainians withdrew entirely from the Donbass. And this is something that we've heard. Remember, way back in August, we were hearing this after Steve Witkoff made the trip to Moscow. And there's been, a lot of, you hear all kinds of things, and there's all kinds of, deliberate disinformation. I think that happens all, but this is something that came up again and again. It wasn't just one report. So it seemed like there really was something behind it. And I remember us discussing that back then. And now it's come up again. So you have the feeling that I think that Putin really may have made the offer. Now, I think he may have made the offer knowing that it would almost certainly be refused. But when you make an offer, if it by some amazing chance is accepted, you have to live up to your part of the bargain. So he actually did put it on the table. I think he did. Because again, we're hearing the same language. So I think that's been something that the Russians have put out there. And I think that, Zelensky hasn't said it openly, but he said that he would not give up any territory. He would not refuse to withdraw from any territory. So I think he was responding directly to that.
Right.
And
right.
which is, again, is so very foolish. I mean, it is a major concession. It would actually be difficult for the Russians to do that. It would be, I think, quite unpopular with a lot of people within Russia. So it was, but I think it's something that Putin did. First of all, that he realized, he really wants these negotiations to get started. He really does want to negotiate an end. I think it's been clear from the beginning. He's always described as this, this bloodthirsty madman, but he's always been working, hoping for a negotiated settlement prior to to February 2022. And again, remember, the day after that, the SMO was launched, he made the offer, to negotiate a settlement. So I think that he is doing this. It would be a major concession. Now, is it foolish? I mean, let's look at it. Okay, we'll take Putin's position. You say that, this is, it would be a concession, and you would not have made good on your promise, really, to be honest, let's say, to the people of Kherson and of Zaporozhye. And I think that there is a real problem with that. But I think the understanding is it would be a de facto recognition. It would be, kind of the mirror image of what you hear on the other side. We would de facto of a ceasefire, de facto recognize the Russian control of it, but we would work in the future to get it back. And that's what he would say about this. These are our territories, but we de facto, for the time being, recognize Ukrainian control of parts of those territories, but we would work to get it back. But let's be honest, you'll never get it back, in our lifetimes. So he actually would be giving up on that, and that would be, I think, a serious concession. But on the other hand, you could have the end of the war. You can save 100,000 lives. And that's nothing to sneer at. Now, let's say on the more nationalist side, the critics of Putin, let's say we can imagine the kind of arguments that would be made against Putin, against such a concession. And it would be that, okay, you've actually demonstrated weakness. These people can't, it would be part of a larger agreement where no NATO for Ukraine, everything else. But you have, you failed to take the rest of these territories, and they're not going to keep their part of the bargain, because we've seen what they've done, again and again, like again with the Minsk Accords. They will, and so you actually have not solved the problem. The war will restart, because that's immediately what they're going to do. They're still, whatever they say, they are, they're absolutely, obsessed with taking back those territories, and they will attempt to do so. The war will start again, and they will be stronger than ever, and will be in a relatively weaker position. And so that this would be, a deadly mistake. I think that's, very roughly, very crudely would be the arguments made on both sides here. Now, I don't think it's, again, it's moot, because clearly, and I think perhaps Putin in doing this understood that almost better than 99% chance this offer would be rejected. It has been rejected by Zelensky. And now you can say, I think it's not just, it's like a show. I think that Putin really does want to negotiate a settlement, and will go farther than, most of the Russian leadership, make more concessions than most to get it. But it's also something he can demonstrate to his many allies. It's like, I actually did offer this concession, which you understand was very hard for me to do. And they rejected it. So we really don't have a choice. It does strengthen his position vis-a-vis his friends and allies out there.
Yeah, I mean, he said he knows that it's going to be rejected, because we know Zelensky's going to reject it. But how much sovereignty does Zelensky really have? I mean, he's obviously being propped up. His whole government's being propped up by the United States and NATO and at large. So couldn't Trump just say, you have to take this deal? When we've seen Trump do this before, it gets to a point where he finally puts his foot down. I mean, he does that with Israel, but then Israel just breaks it the next day. But it at least something does happen. Maybe that could be a possibility. It would just say, Zelensky, you have to take this. This is a huge win. It'll be a huge concession, like you said, for Putin to make. And I think Putin, if this deal does get made, and they have to pull out of Zaporozhye and Kherson area, as he said, and give the Donbass, then I think Putin's going to be in trouble domestically. He might lose his office, because I think the plan is to go through Odessa, get Kharkov as well in the north, but connect all the way to Transnistria. If he doesn't do that, then I think there's going to be a lot of bitter people in Russia. Because we know that that's kind of the Russian language speaking belt area through there. And we know what's happening in Transnistria with the Moldovan elections. This is a potential flashpoint. These people in Transnistria are kind of isolated and stranded. So I think they're going to try to connect there. And then it also just cuts Ukraine completely off from the Black Sea, so this would be a huge win for Ukraine, or for Zelensky, if he takes this deal. And I understand Zelensky just has this position, no matter what, we're taking Crimea and we're going to keep on fighting until Putin and Russia collapse. But the person that should be in the driver's seat is the U.S., right? So why isn't...
Yeah.
Do you think that's possibly Trump just says, you got to take the deal, or it's, pulling the plug on everything? You don't get our intelligence, you don't get our money, you don't get our weapons, it's over.
Right. Well, it's similar, actually, again, to, the relationship between Israel and the U.S. is in some ways similar to this relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine, in the sense that in both cases, the smaller countries are, Ukraine and Israel, are really completely dependent upon the U.S., for military and economic support to a huge extent. And yeah, I mean, he clearly does have leverage over Ukraine that he does not have over Russia. And if you're looking at it realistically, you'd say, okay, what can I do? I cannot force Russia to do it. There's this brave talk, the 500% sanctions on secondary tariffs and all this, and tomahawks and whatever. None of that. First of all, the tariffs are not going to happen. If the tomahawks happen, again, there can be real consequences for the NATO side that could be very, very scary. But even if, no matter what, they just can't make a difference in the outcome of the war. And I think most people even acknowledge that, even the advocates for the Tomahawks. He does not have the leverage over Russia, but he does have it over Ukraine. He said, like, if you just say, okay, we're shutting off Starlink tomorrow and no more intelligence, just that would have that could bring about the collapse pretty quickly. I mean, one of the reasons that Ukraine is still in the fight is that they do have this massive intelligence support, right? And then, we're not even going to sell, we're selling arms to the Europeans who hand them to you, but we're not even going to sell them anymore. You do that, and again, just very quickly it would be over at the Ukrainians. So he has tremendous leverage. He could force the Ukrainians to make the deal, but he doesn't. And that's unfortunate. He may feel like politically he's incapable of it. I don't know. It would be very, very difficult for him to maintain that position, especially at this point. Maybe if he went in from the very beginning with a united team, again, as we've said before, that perhaps maybe he could just pull that off. But he doesn't have a united team. It's not just that he would be under pressure from the Europeans and from the Democrats and from, much of the Republican Party, but even from his closest advisors, his own administration, because of the kind of people he's hired, the kind of people that surround him. He would just be alone, and I don't think he could make that demand. Unfortunately, that again is in large part a result of his own mistakes and the people that he chose. But anyway, according, I think it was the Washington Post again, anyway, there were reports that came out about the conversation between Zelensky and Trump, that followed the phone call between Trump and Putin. And according to this report, it was very, very unpleasant. It was very tense. There was a lot of shouting. And that initially, actually, Trump was saying, you got to give up that territory. You got to give up the Donbass. And then at the end, according to, this report, Trump said, kind of agreed to the old ceasefire thing again. So he's already backed off on that. And then it's stupid. Okay, well, already the Russians have made it clear to you they're not doing that. They've actually made this concession, and you couldn't push that through. Then, what are we doing? There are no negotiations that are possible.
Well, why doesn't Russia change its tactics on the battlefield and go more after command and control centers, go after the leadership? Because to me, it seems cruel for Russia to grind down the Ukraine military the way they have. Because we know that most of these soldiers do not want to fight. We see the forced conscription. We know that they don't want to be involved in this war, but they're the ones dying on behalf of the elite in Kyiv or Lviv, or these areas. That's where they're being controlled. Why doesn't Russia go after them? And that can maybe bring in about the end of the war. I mean, we're talking about, will this eventually end when things just get so bad and people are freezing to death in Ukraine that they have some type of coup or something like this? It's like, well, maybe if you took out the people that are not willing to negotiate, that have already sacrificed basically all of your manpower, then the future generations of Ukraine are just gone now, thanks to this. Take that guy out. It gives an opportunity for the people to come back and take control of their country again. Is that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a difficult question. One thing is, it's not clear, for example, that decapitation strikes would, in the end, really change the orientation of the leadership. I mean,
well, maybe if they do a couple to just scare the pants off Zelensky, and he's like, okay, let's settle this, to show that, look, we can get you.
Right.
Right. Why are we killing all these, boys that are in these trenches in the front lines?
Right. Yeah. I know people have made that argument, and I don't dismiss it, but I'm not nearly as confident as they are in general that this would actually have a beneficial effect. I mean, you just think about the decapitation strikes that Israel has carried out against its adversaries. It hasn't changed. It hasn't eliminated the organizations. They're still there. They're still opposed to Israel.
It's not comparable though, I think, right? Because like if you talk about like Yemen or like they're not fighting on the front lines like we have here. We have like we think over like Colonel Douglas McGregor thinks it could be like 1.5 million Ukrainians dead now. Like there's a huge loss, and I think there is, and we know that the government is unpopular in these countries. We know when Israel carries out these strikes in Iran or Yemen, they're not unpopular government. It has the opposite effect because they know who the enemy is. Here in Ukraine, it's not. We know that the vast majority of people want this war to end, but their government won't end it. So like it's a completely different, I think, environment.
Yeah, it is different. Yeah, you're right. It's different. I don't know, but I'm still not confident that it really would succeed in bringing about, a helpful change of government. We could, in fact, maybe the Banderites, which is the real extreme Banderites, the self-proclaimed Banderites, would just seize power, and things would get even worse.
I would say 3 years of grinding down the Ukrainian military. Sure, it's been effective. You've really weakened also NATO, but I mean, you've killed so many people.
Yeah, no, I understand. Again, that's an argument that Jim Jatras makes, and I see his point. I'm just not sure. Maybe this is something that the Russians have looked at and they've assessed that it's not going to help the situation. It's just not a real option. I imagine that's something that they are watching very, very closely. Again, perhaps I'm just being too willing to trust in or defer to the wisdom of the Russian military in this respect, the Russian leadership. Perhaps this is something they should have done before, but I'm not confident about it. It is a risky undertaking that could involve, let's say, many civilian casualties and really rapidly raise the temperature, considered to be very provocative by the NATO and could invite, NATO, direct NATO involvement. There are all those risks that you have to consider. But it might be worth it. Again, there's risks not doing that, as again Jim Jatras points out. He acknowledges that there is a risk. There is a very serious risk, right. But not going at it slowly is also risky, and it gives NATO a chance to actually build up its forces and maybe to intervene more forcefully in the future. I don't have an easy answer to that. I see the point, but I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that it's really the way to go.
Yeah, I mean, just if we take a look at these past 3 years, it's just been horrific in terms of the human cost.
Yeah.
And then, but also in terms of just escalation and future risks, where we are now is a lot worse than we were 3 years ago in terms of attempts of nuclear war. It hasn't reduced the risk that much because we don't exercise the leverage that we have over Ukraine to end it. It's clear that this is, and I guess at the end of the day, maybe this is all why it's so important, is that the significance of this war is that I think when this war ends, it will establish whether or not there is a U.S. hegemon anymore. Do you think that is truly the significance of it, and that is what is permeated the ruling elite in the West, and so they just can't back down because they know that this is the end if they do? Is that where we are?
Well, that seems to be where they are. Or I think that's the way they're thinking about it, and that's why they find it impossible to actually make any compromises. Again, I think it's very foolish for various reasons. In the end, they'll lose even more badly because they refuse to negotiate a solution. If they had negotiated it before, let's say, again, the launch of the SMO, when the Russians were clearly, offering, to negotiate, to have a negotiation to avert war. If they had taken that offer at that point and worked out something, again, I think there would have been very little loss of Western prestige. I think in the end there would have been none. But I think in their own minds they couldn't do that because this is something that they said. Because it would be to acknowledge that Russia was, in essence, a real rival, to accept that they were a great power, and they that was it was agreed upon among them. I think firmly believe that Russia was not a great power, and we cannot acknowledge them as such. It's still Russia of the 1990s, and they simply have to accept what we decide. We can't now say, okay, make this adjustment. They are a great power. And so we ended up with the war, unfortunately, and now it's continued, and they simply have not been able to back off from that position.
But let's say if they did, and they just accepted the current proposal from Putin, where, okay, they give up the Donbass, they freeze the lines everywhere else, and then it's over, it's done. Will that be the end of the West? Is that just a real tacit admission? I mean, we're spin masters. We could spin it out this way. Look, Putin would have taken all of Ukraine, exactly. And now look, so...
That's what they're saying. You're right. So I think that they should. It would be... It would be maybe acknowledgement of the limits of their power. Okay, we weren't actually able to defeat Russia. But, yeah, there are still ways of spinning it. And in fact, you see that spin machine working right now. It's like, there's always this exaggeration, this sort of the straw man that they create. It's like Putin wanted to take over all of Ukraine. He thought he could do it in 3 days or something. And Putin never saw that. It was clearly he never had that intention, never stated it. But it's something that they say that he intended to do. And then they say, look how miserably he failed. And they've been losing millions of men. Again, they'll exaggerate Russian losses. And they only took, 1% or 2% of Ukraine after that initial incursion in 2022.
Right.
So that seems to me would be the intelligent thing to do. But they just seem to be incapable of even doing that, acknowledging any limits on their own power.
Okay, so if they accept the deal that's on the table now, or something similar like the Istanbul Plus or whatever, then you think that it's possible that the U.S. would preserve its hegemonic status in some sense or form, spin it as a victory. Things more or less, things have fundamentally changed in the world, but they can kind of continue semi-normally for us in the West. But,
yeah, right. It wouldn't necessarily be a fatal blow. I think there's no question that U.S. or let's say Western hegemonic prestige would be harmed, that it will have taken a loss, but it's not necessarily a fatal loss. I think, already just the fact that Russia is still standing in spite of all the sanctions, et cetera, that shows. That's already a loss that they won't accept, but is real, and the rest of the world sees it. And then, after all the threats to take back all the territories and the failure to do that, that, even in spite of the spinning, I think most of the world will look at that and say, okay, yeah, NATO maybe isn't as powerful as we once thought. But it doesn't mean...
People will say it wasn't NATO, they can...
In the West, they will. They'll convince themselves. I'm talking about the rest of the world that I think has a more realistic view of things. But in the West, they would do that. So they can go along, convincing themselves that they're very, very powerful. And they will have taken a loss, but it's not necessarily, it won't be a fatal loss. But the longer this goes on, in the end, the worse it is for them. So they really should take the deal now, but they just can't think that way. It's just that nobody wants to retreat from that initial position, is that we can't deal with Russia. They are not a great power, and they will lose. And the only reason they haven't lost yet is just that we haven't shown, enough willpower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I honestly think that the U.S. backing of Israel and its genocide in Gaza has been more damaging than anything that Ukraine has done so far. If we freeze it right now, would you say that? I feel like it could be.
Well, I would say that's definitely true within the West.
Right. That's what.
I think there's definitely true. As for the whole world, I think it's not quite so clear. I think both conflicts have been very damaging, and have. I think that you have to say actually the Ukrainian conflict has done more to rearrange the map of the world, the geopolitical landscape than Israel. Again, Russia is now very, very tight with China, and has the multipolar world, I think, is really has made great strides as a result of this, and not so much because of the conflict in Palestine. Let's not call it a conflict, the genocide in Palestine. Um, but within the West, it seems like, again, like the spin machine's done a good job, so that most Westerners, unfortunately, the majority of them believe the mainstream arguments and think that Russia is not doing is in a quagmire, that Ukraine is amazing and could turn this around any day, and so on. There are a lot of people that really believe that, both in the general population and among the leadership. But there have been real inroads. There really has been a change of attitude towards Israel, a very significant one. And when we see protests, there have been some, protests with regard to the Ukraine war in Europe anyway, but nothing of the scale that we've seen with regard to Palestine. I think there has been a real sea change, both, and in Europe and in this country too.
Mm-hmm. Well, going back to Ukraine, will it get to a point where U.S., if we pause now, we said the U.S. hegemonic facade could maybe persist, but will it get to a point where, because we failed to negotiate and accept the deal that's on the table now, that it just completely just shatters any perception of U.S. hegemonic dominance or NATO dominance, economic dominance like that? We'll get to a point where it leads to essentially the disintegration of the Western systems, of our financial systems, of NATO, is that what's on the line at some point? If this,
yeah,
if well, we yeah, stay again,
I wouldn't, I wouldn't point to any one thing, any one event. Eventually there will be a straw that breaks the camel's back, and that straw could be Ukraine. That's possible, but it's something that's happening. We've talked about the three pillars: the soft power, economic power, and military power. And all of those have been greatly weakened, and I think all of those pillars are going to eventually fall. I think there's no question about it. So I wouldn't make a firm prediction as to which one will fall first and which event will cause the collapse again of Western hegemony. But it's clear that if the U.S. It really is, the U.S. is the only one that really has a choice here. And, they don't take the offer. If they really took the offer from Russia, they could make it happen. I mean, it's at least theoretically possible, right? Because they do have the leverage over Ukraine and make Ukraine accept this. Yeah, they would be, again, U.S.-led Western hegemony would have taken a blow, but it could actually still stagger on, I think, for a while. But if they don't take the offer, and they won't, and then Russia is just forced pretty much to just continue to they'll take all of the Donbass, they'll take, and then go on and take Zaporozhye, which they've made quite a bit of progress actually within Zaporozhye, and then eventually they'll make the crossing into Kherson and take that, and then if they march to Odessa, and if they take Kharkov, the city of Kharkov, and the whole oblast of it, that's the loss is going to be obvious. It's something that they'll do what they can to spin it, but it just won't be very convincing even to their own people. The people say, yeah, you lost that. And that's going to hurt them a lot more. It is going to be a blow, and it could be the straw that breaks the camel's back.
What are you hoping for? Because part of me, I think the goal that I want, and that I think most of us should envision, is a peaceful transition to the multipolar world, where the U.S. is a willing participant in the multipolar world, that gives up its dream of U.S. hegemony, and we can show respect and cooperation towards great powers like Russia and China, and it would just be so great for the whole world. But the question is, how do we get there? It seems like the U.S. is just, is not adopting that mindset. It's viewing Russia, China, all these countries that oppose U.S. hegemony as adversaries and doing whatever they can to take them down. So part of me is like, should we wish for just complete defeat or collapse instead of a negotiated settlement? Because if we get a negotiated settlement, then it still allows the U.S. hegemonic mindset to persist and exist. And we are still in a very dangerous world, because we have one rogue player, the United States, that refuses to admit reality that there are many great players and we all have to work together. Instead, it has to be my way or the highway. So how do we get there? Are you hoping that this defeat will, that there's a negotiated settlement, or are you hoping that there will be a more major defeat into some type of collapse?
Yeah.
Like, but all of it is scary. All of it's
Yeah,
scary.
it is. It's all scary. That's right.
But the obvious, there's such an obvious solution. It's just to say like, hey guys, let's just stop this. China, mad respect to everything you've done, lifting all your people out of poverty and your industrial capacity. Maybe you can help us revitalize some of that here. We've clearly lost our way. Just some self-humility, just some admission of errors and this willingness to work in a new world where people of different civilizations and different cultures command some respect as well, and that we can respect them and learn from each other and work together. I mean, it just seems so common sense, but we're not seeing any signs of it from the West.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah, no, that would obviously be the best solution. But we aren't seeing any signs. Again, Trump, we spent a lot of time criticizing, more than criticizing, ridiculing Trump, because I think he deserves ridicule often. I think there's no question about it. But from time to time, he shows a lot more. He shows that common sense. I think it's like there's part of him that understands that. And so that's why I think a lot of us were very hopeful, because occasionally he would come out and say things like that. It's like, hey, why can't we get along with Russia? Whatever. And I recently had that conversation with Putin, and I think he got convinced to say, hey, okay, Putin's made a real offer, and he made some effort. He actually had a heated argument with Zelensky, but then he backed down. It's just that you can't depend on him.
I know.
And so it's like the one guy who actually could do something and actually does show some understanding of the issues. And, like I've said, he's not a neocon. He's not really, he likes this image of a very, kind of muscular macho America, but he doesn't feel like the need to export the American way of life to the rest of the world. Let's put it that way. And he is, I think, willing to get along with some of the other great powers. Maybe he just wants to take it out on Venezuela or something. That's where which is kind of ugly and everything, I admit, but it's still, I think, a step in the right direction compared to what we had before. It's like, okay, we have our sphere of influence, so-called, in the Western hemisphere, but that's better than the whole globe. But he's the one guy that could do it, and he's just not capable. I mean, it's, first of all, he is up against a lot. I mean, there are a lot of structural barriers. There's just so many. That is the deep state, et cetera, et cetera. But then it's also his own personality. I mean, it's both those things. So it's just not going to happen, unfortunately.
So what's your path to multipolarity, where the U.S. can be part of it as well? Is it only complete collapse?
I think so. And let's just hope that it happens. It doesn't have to be complete collapse, but I mean, there's something, we have to suffer some sort of loss on, let's say either the economic or military front, or, I think already we do see a real degradation of soft power, even within this country. Again, there's just like the percentage of people that really trust their government, think trust that our leadership has a plan to take us to a better place. That has gone way, way, way down. It has been declining for decades, and that decline is accelerating. So we really do see that soft power has declined even, within this country, but there's still this faith that a lot of people have in the U.S. military, and there's this complacency about our economic situation that is not justified. And I think there has to be a few more blows to the point where we really wake up. And I hope, I would like to think that would lead to self-reflection and real reform within this country. But unfortunately, the tendency seems to always to look for an external enemy. We talk about the drug problem we have. And so we go after Venezuela. It has nothing to do with it, right? And that we may see more of that. It may just lead to more kind of a general flailing and demonization of more foreign enemies and more wars. That's the danger. I think whatever happens, that's unfortunately very likely, and I just hope we survive all that.
Oh boy, we need Thomas Massey to be president. Maybe he can get us out of this mess. I don't think we'll make it there. Okay, well, I think we can end there, Dad, unless there's anything else you want to talk
Yeah.
about.
Um, well, no, I think that we can end there. Next time there have been interesting developments on the in Gaza, but perhaps it deserves a whole other
Yeah,
episode. Maybe
I
we'll do
wasn't
that.
planning on talking so long about Ukraine. I did have some questions about the ceasefire breakdown, but I don't think we get into that. Also, I think another interesting thing is the story about China catching the NSA in this hack
Yeah.
of their to compromise their time system, which I think was very interesting. It just because I think this exposes the world that we live in, just the vulnerabilities that we have. So basically what happened is that the NSA was caught in an extended campaign between 2022 to summer of 2024, where they have infiltrated China's central time distribution center in Xi'an. And you may think like, oh, who cares if they change the time? But this thing underpins everything. They change it just 1 second. The financial systems, the rail systems, satellites, defense, telecommunications, everything can go haywire. And so just these things that we don't think about, that there are these points of vulnerability. And some of them may be vulnerable. And if things get crazy and people start wanting to, threaten people with missiles and nukes, there's always these black swan events that could happen that we may not even be aware of, that all of a sudden someone flips a switch and it's like, uh-oh, chaos in the streets because nobody knows, the system that one second was changed. Now the whole system's gone haywire and everybody doesn't know what to do. Electricity doesn't work. Water's not running, whatever.
Right.
So it does make you just think that there's just a fine line that separates us from chaos. And the more and more we get into this, kinetic wars and this trade wars, this posturing, that line starts to become thinner and thinner, and there's this possibility that something could happen, and that just worries me about that, because that's kind of also the U.S. and Israel. Their kind of MO is these subversions and these tiny little pain points, choke points that they can identify in different systems. Anyways, we don't have to get into it.
Okay.
And another
very,
thing,
very interesting stuff. There's plenty more to talk about,
very
but we'll do it
interesting.
next time.
I think the Nexperia thing within Europe also is very interesting. Just like how Europe just continues to just blast guns to its face constantly. With this, it's their automotive industry is in real trouble. And also, I wanted to talk about the government shutdown. Like it's here in the U.S. This will be my last question. All right, I know I'm starting to ramble a bit, but why do you think the government is still shut down? Because I was just listening to Colonel Daniel Davis, and he was saying that, there's always this rhetoric of like, it's the Democrats are doing this. But he's saying that Republicans themselves don't want the government to be shut down, there's signs of that as well. Do you have any?
I'm sorry, I don't have anything to say on it, but I'll make an effort to look into it. I've been focusing on other things, so I have no comment. But maybe I'll have a comment on Wednesday.
This is me just jumping to things, and just when I see things on X, it's like it's because of the Epstein files. They're like Massey's trying to get it released, and they're like, you know what? Let's just shut down the government, and then we won't release the files.
I don't think so, but
I don't know.
Okay. I don't think so.
It might be a factor. I don't know.
Anyway,
there's so many threads to pull down on these days. It's so crazy. Okay. Anyways, okay, yeah, we can end it there.
Okay.
All right. Thanks a bunch, Dad. Have a good rest of your day.
Okay.
Talk to you soon. All right. Bye-bye.